So this is a fairly general deck. I'm going to talk in detail about things. Again, feel free to jump in with questions because there may be areas where you particularly want to go deep. So here we go. Customer development, I always kind of start with this because I feel like customer development is the least used part of the original lean startup practicum. People are really fond of developing quickly. They're really fond of using low-cost tools and using things in the cloud. But customer development is kind of that hard part that we aspire to, and we started reading 4 steps, but really it was really long, so we just never quite got through it. But I care a lot about this. I think the reason it's been abandoned is because it doesn't really come naturally to us. Most of us would rather be building things, and stopping, the notion of stopping and talking and maybe not knowing what's going to go on is really frustrating. I am also impatient, so most of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is quick, and hopefully you can get through it quickly. And the big thing that I start off to kind of get people's attention is that you are wrong a lot. And it's not because you're not smart, because the smartest people are also wrong a lot. So at Yammer, we actually A/B test every feature that we build, roll it out to a control group. We test it against a few key metrics. We have a hypothesis in the beginning. We think that by changing this, we're going to impact this metric. We launch, at best, 60% of those experiments. So, and we're pretty good at this by now. We actually have thought about it a lot. We do customer research. We do customer development. We talk to people. We use our own product heavily. So we're wrong a lot. And we actually had this, the little citation here is this great paper that's a little bit out of date, but I've seen current references to it, which is that Google and Amazon and Facebook and Netflix and everyone else who is data-driven basically has the same number. They're all wrong about half the time. So no matter how strong your intuition is, or even how strong you feel about the customer who said, this is the thing I need, it is probably not right. And if you start with that as kind of a basis, then you realize that it's really important to continually challenge yourself. So the reason we all like the lean startup is because its goal is to help prevent waste, and the biggest possible waste is building something that people don't want. My estimate is that each hour of customer development saves at least 5 hours of design and coding, more likely upwards of 20. So it may feel like a long time to spend on interviews, but it saves a lot of time down the road. The most typical thing I've found is that you are probably overbuilding, because we all want to overbuild, because in our minds we have the awesome shiny car. But to someone who is walking and whose feet hurt, a beat up bus looks pretty good. So you should be talking to customers who are happy to see that beat up bus. And if you are talking to customers who are like, I'll just keep walking until a nice car comes along, those probably aren't good customers. Because it's very, very hard to get picky customers won over. And if you find yourself adding a whole lot of stuff, that's usually what's happening. So this is just a reference. I've already emailed over the slides so you guys can have them later, but I just have kind of a list of tools that I put together for a lean startup machine a couple months ago, just things that help with customer development in general. So the steps. We'll kind of walk through, and I'll give a little bit of detail on all of these. Most of you have done some of these already, but basically, your first step is you're going to form a hypothesis. You're going to find potential customers to talk to, and there's an art to doing this well. You're going to ask the right questions, which is actually not quite as hard as you think. Trying to figure out how to make sense of the answers, and figuring out what to build to keep learning. And whenever I talk about customer development, again, people have this kind of sense of spending a huge amount of time, but most of the time you're doing just enough to get to the next little thing that you're going to build or mock up or show to people. So hypothesis is the first step, and it sounds the simplest, but it's actually where I think most people start going wrong, which is that you're about your problem, not your product. So you are trying to solve a problem. And I hear a lot of hypotheses that are like, I think people need this thing, or I think companies will buy this thing. That's already biasing you down kind of a path that you don't necessarily want to go down. So it's problem, first of all. The second thing is that it needs to be testable, which means by definition that it needs to be narrow. It is very difficult to assess whether people or businessmen or doctors or any category like that is going to be interested in your product. It is much easier to say orthopedic surgeons who are in this metro area or have primarily elderly patients. You know, that's a subset where you can likely talk to like several people in a row and they will have consistent problems, they will have consistent feedback, they will, you know, most likely either all kind of like your product or all be completely and politely disinterested. So that's your kind of starting point. Don't know if you guys are using Business Model Canvas or anything like it. Yeah.
We can. Yeah.
I like this as a rough guidance towards hypotheses. I know there are some accelerators and some startup programs that use it on a week-by-week basis, and they're taking each square of this and changing things every week. I think it's more useful for me personally as a tool to remind yourself about things. I think one of the mistakes that people make in hypotheses is forgetting important stakeholders. So the person who is using your product, there's also usually someone who is impacted, someone who needs to write the check, someone who needs to approve of it, someone who, you know, their job is being changed by the nature of this thing. So just kind of including these things can be useful in terms of helping you construct what you're going to do. The basic formula that I lay out to people is, I believe that this kind of person has this kind of problem in this kind of situation. There will be times that you need to adjust it. Two-sided market, you're probably going to have two of them. This kind of person has this kind of problem. This kind of person has a different kind of problem. But the beauty of this is if you can't fit it in a slide that's this size, you are probably overthinking it. Again, because you're focusing on person, problem, task, it makes it harder for you to make this about the product that you already want to build or the feature that you've already envisioned. And I emphasize a lot to people to write these down, which sounds silly, but I found that what happens a lot of times is people have hypotheses and they've internalized it in their head, but they don't write it down. And what happens is that naturally your product will start to drift a little bit and you'll adjust. But if you haven't got that sanity check of where you started, you tend to start just thinking that you're right all the time because you keep adjusting and you're getting positive feedback and you're like, wow, all my hypotheses have been right. I am awesome. I don't need to do this customer development stuff after all. That becomes very, very kind of damaging. The other thing is if you have these, as you discover which things are right and wrong, that can tell you a little bit about where you're going next. You might have had, for example, the sort of self-serve versus high touch. If your hypothesis is around, I believe these kind of people have this problem and they need to solve it on their own and want to solve it without intervention, that's a very specific case. And if you're finding evidence that violates that, you might find yourself going to that higher touch model and wanting to experiment with that earlier on. The other thing is that sometimes the hypotheses you have early on are valid later. This is something we found with Kissmetrics. When we started out building the web analytics product, our hypothesis was around sort of technical product managers. Actually, the exact kind of people that you're targeting. People who want information, who don't really know how to get it. They don't want to learn code, but they want it at their fingertips. That's who we thought was going to be our first audience. We didn't get those customers until almost a year into our beta. We started out with CTOs and data guys who just wanted another tool or wanted to facilitate their workload. So it changed a lot of what we built in the beginning. Because we had this written down, it was actually really easy to start seeing when the customers started shifting. And then all the assumptions that we had written around this original hypothesis were like, all this thinking is valid now. So it saved us a lot of work in terms of kind of going back and rethinking it. Those of you who have read Steve Blank, yeah.
Just double click on that. So you had a persona or a person that you're going after. But for the first year, it was a totally different person. And did you modify the hypothesis then when you're going?
We did. As we started talking to people, we modified it to, we believe that this kind of person, we believe that more technical, the CTOs, co-founders have the problem of needing data early on.
And then the market just took you back to the original hypothesis a year later. Okay, you didn't plan for
We hoped for it because the where we started was more niche than where we wanted the product to go. There's only so many CTOs and co-founders out there. It's hard to build a business on that.
Yeah.
But we realized that those were people who could sanity check the product really well, and their word of mouth was critical to getting other people. So the reason that the product managers came along a year later is because from all of their more technical friends who they trusted, they were hearing this is the product they should use.
They were like the early adopters.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one of the tricky things is that product managers don't tend to have a lot of budget, but once they were able to kind of go and say, look, this thing's been stress tested and we should use it, then they could get the budget, and then it wasn't a problem. So those kind of things happen surprisingly often, I think.
And did you do that also for Yammer, which is like a horizontal product? Did you have a use case? Did you have a specific person initially you're targeting?
No, Yammer's actually been a little bit in violation of this because technically it's for, quote, everyone, but which is dangerous. But I think the theory is that it is so dependent on network effects that there is not a single subset of user that you can rely on to have it take off. Yammer is an enterprise social network sharing information within a company. You can't have an effective information share if just the tech-savvy people are using it, or just the millennials, or just any particular subset. So our assumption was, a little bit of the okay, just out of the box, this thing has to work. And so assumptions we made were basically, we believe that people in the workplace have a hard time finding information, don't want to send a million emails. So that was kind of the origin of that. It's like there needs to be a better way for people to communicate in a lightweight fashion.
Cool, that's great.
Those of you who are familiar with Steve Blank will know this diagram. This is one of those things that is not that hard, but having the discipline to stick to it is very hard. It's one of those things where I actually strongly recommend having either an advisor or a peer be your sanity check, because a lot of times it is visible to someone else that your target customer is not a very good target customer. It will not be that visible to you. Has a problem, not that hard to find. Is aware of having a problem is surprisingly harder to find than you would think. There are lots of people who have a problem and don't really know about it. And you can overcome this, but it is very difficult. Company that's had a relative amount of success doing this, Style Seat, they do bookings for spas, hair salons, online, small businesses. So their target was small business owners. When they first went to talk to small business owners, they were not aware that they had a problem. They had a book. If they realized if they lost it, they would be screwed, but they had a book, they had pencil and paper, they had a phone, they talked to their customers. It was not on their mind to try and electronify this thing and to try and gain more customers and to increase customer loyalty. They were not aware that they had a problem. So they managed through really intensive customer development to overcome that because they could see that there was a problem, but that's a challenge. That's handicapping yourself in the beginning. Has been actively seeking a solution is another example. I was a mentor for one of the Steve Blank executive education classes. I worked with a team who was trying to develop something to help people not lose things, basically like RFID tags. I think at this point there actually are products like that out, but this was 3 years ago. And they talked to people who lost things. They did a really excellent job of finding, they'd go to a bunch of people and say, who among your friends chronically loses things? And they would ask until they had this subset. And they talked to people who lose expensive things, leather jackets, laptops, etc. And they said, do you have a problem with losing things? Oh yeah, totally. It's terrible. My wife is ready to kill me. I've lost 3 phones, this year. Lots of acknowledgement that they had a problem. Were they doing anything about it? No. In fact, they actually had one guy said that he just budgeted an extra $2,000 a year to replace stuff that he lost. He was completely I don't know if I would buy this. I'm just used to this by now. I just do this. Which I thought was crazy. They were talking about buying a product for, maybe $50 a year to prevent $2,000 in loss, and he wasn't sure how it would work, and he was just used to that. So people are not rational. That's something that I repeat a lot. If you've read behavioral economics books, you will see this over and over again. All of the Chip and Dan Heath, everything they've written is brilliant along those lines. People are not rational. Dan Ariely, of course, the other And so if you start out by assuming that they are, you will screw yourself over. Has put together a solution out of piece parts. This is a really great solution to look for. What are people doing? And the question I usually ask to get to that is how are you solving this today? And a lot of times the answer is I am not. And this one is very hard to get because a lot of times when the answer is I'm not, it's, but I would love to have a product that would magically solve this for me. And that is a very dangerous thing because of course you want to hear that. But someone who has not attempted to work around but also expresses interest in the magic problem that will solve it is not actually that likely to use that product. Because if they were really, truly desperate, they would be doing something with pencil and paper or workarounds or phone systems or hiring consultants or something. And then finally, has or can acquire a budget. Enterprise, this is very tricky. Several people doing medical things. As you know, budget is not straightforward there. The person who is using it is probably not the person who is paying for it. I have seen more aspiring educational startups go kaput because of this, same thing. So the people you're talking to should have money or be able to get money.
And who's your customer versus who's your user?
Yes.
So is there a distinction between a customer and a user? How do you define that?
I would typically say the customer is the person who is writing you a check.
Yes.
And the user is the person who is actually using it. Most people would say this is the reason why enterprise software is so across the board atrocious, because there is a great divide between the customer and the user. The customer has historically been the IT guy who is technical and doesn't really care anyways, and then the user is everyone else who doesn't really know how to use things. And there's no repercussions. The IT guy doesn't get fired because people can't figure out how to save their documents. There's just this barrier. And consumerization of software is changing that. There is a little bit of the IT guy, if not getting fired, having their budget dramatically lowered, but there is still a big difference and something to be aware of.
So Cindy, the Accelerator, we have two religions, we have two schools of thought. We have sell or die, which Chris Duggan, who's the former head of Badgeville, is the big proponent of it. It's all about only build products that people are going to pay for, because you're survival with it. And then we have Adam, who's like grow or die, basically, and don't even think about monetization, just grow, 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 grow. Any feedback or reactions that when it comes to customer development, is it?
I would say that grow or die is kind of like playing the lottery. There are a limited number of people who will grow and be able to turn that into something. You need people to invest in something. That might not be writing you a check. That might be investing a learning curve, being willing to evangelize your product to their users or distribute it to their users. If you have the IT guy who's willing to put it on every laptop in an entire workstation, that's a big investment. If you have people who are willing to, in an ad model, give you all their personal data, that's also an investment. But if people aren't willing to give you something, it's very hard to think that you will ever be able to get something from them. And Yammer started from bottom up. It's been very successful with that, but getting people to pay for it has always been a challenge. And we have been, I think, somewhat lucky in that there are certain levers we can push on IT people, like having control of your data or being able to kick people out of your network, that are worth paying for. But they're actually not paying for the value of the product, or at least in the early days they were not. People who were paying for Yammer weren't paying because Yammer was an awesome product. They were paying because this thing was already out there, and for God's sake, I want some control over it. So, it got us money. We actually had a pretty good conversion. I think we had about 20% conversion to paid all along, which is pretty good. But I also think that was a little bit lucky, and not everyone is going to have a lever like that to push.
That's great. Thanks.
So finding potential customers, those of you who have customers, awesome. Those are people you can use. If you are looking for other customers, some of the ways that I say to go into this, and even if you have customers, I actually recommend sometimes stepping back and talking to people who haven't seen anything yet, because they are untainted. The people who are your customers have already seen what you have to offer. And to your comment, telling someone what you do first, if I were to guess what went wrong in your phone call, I would say that the person on the other end was afraid that they were being sold something. Because you have said, here's what I do, and then you go back and talk to them, and that makes it clear that you have an agenda. There's a thing that you do. And there's a very different tenor to a conversation when someone knows that you have something versus someone comes in saying, how can I help you?
In the email I sent him, I said that we are building something and we want to hear your feedback. But probably in the phone call I didn't mention that again.
And people are very used to being sold. So there's a lot in the language, and I'll get into that a little bit more. There's a lot in the language you have to say. You have to be very emphatic that you are not actually selling something, that it is all about them. And that might mean being very, very sparse in your description of what you're doing and what problem you're trying to solve in order to make it clear that it's really all about them. So talking to people, obviously your network, your extended network, good place to start. LinkedIn, since you're an enterprise people, that's going to be very popular for you. You can find where people work, you can find job titles, areas, all of that stuff. I recommend signing up and paying for InMails. They are a good deal, $1 an email to actually deliver to someone. You might know someone if they're one step removed, that's great, but a lot of times you'll find people that you have no connection to. And I've found that, in my experience, InMails actually get pretty good response as long as you are short and to the point and respectful, because someone knows that you actually had to pay to send it, and I think that little psychological boost is like, okay, I'm going to at least listen to this person.
Do you have any recommendations on crafting that kind of list, other than being short and sweet?
There are some templates for that, which are linked to somewhere in here. Yeah, there will be more in the book, but I have some already for you guys to look at.
Do you have a rough cuts of your book up on?
Not yet. I think there will be soon. But yeah, that's the part that I have some excerpts for. It's basically just a really short, if I were to summarize, kind of like, hi, I'm working on this problem. I'm talking to you because I would love to get 5 minutes of your time. If it's LinkedIn, I make the ask really, really small, because usually they will talk to you for longer, but no one wants to commit to longer. And then just make it clear that you're not going to bother them anymore if they say no. Quora is actually another really surprisingly good place. There's not universal subject matter coverage, but the people who are on there really like talking about the stuff they care about. So you can find people who have written answers. If you look on the side, you can also find people who followed a question, and that's good for sort of passively interested folks. If you can find those people and kind of click on them and get to the profile, you can send them a direct message. And again, I've gotten really good response rates from that. I think because it is so hard to spam people, it's like 6 clicks in to find the send private message. So it's very clear that you're not just sending this to thousands of people. But again, it's using kind of game mechanics, because you're really saying, I'm talking to you because you seem like an expert, and everyone loves feeling like an expert. Domain-specific websites, of course, if you're on a specific industry, you'll know where those are. But physical places are also pretty good. Maybe not to put up the flyer and have little tear-off strips, but going into a place where your customers are likely to be and talking to the people who work there and asking them for tips has been pretty useful. The last lean startup machine I was mentoring for, there was someone working on a music product. They went into a music store, waited until the employees were not busy, and then started asking, where can I find people who might be interested in this? And they had a huge list of mailing lists and places where people hung out and websites that people went to. Basically, like, save them probably 20 hours worth of time. But these guys were happy to do it because this is something that they cared about.
For the domain-specific websites, is it putting up ads on those sites?
Not so much ads. It's more participating. Not spamming, but participating in the community, which is probably beneficial to you anyways. And then once you've kind of already provided some value, maybe asking, like, I would love to get people, talk to some people. Or surveys are a good kind of stepping stone. They're not useful for customer development per se, but they're a good kind of filter. Someone who will answer a 3-question survey. Your last question could be, would you be willing to talk on the phone for 15 minutes? And again, you'll get a reasonable number of people who say yes to that.
If you're presenting at a meetup and there are potential customers / evangelists there, should your goal for the meetup be to convert them, like to get them on your mailing list, or basically to talk to them individually, or to do like a group thing then and there?
I have a personal and deep hatred of focus groups, so that's going to be mine. Okay, the question is, if you're at a meetup and you find individual people, should your aim be to try and talk to them individually or try to get them all together? And yeah, my response is I have a deep hatred of focus groups. I think they are very, very difficult to do correctly. Even if you're not saying focus group in an official sense, what tends to happen is that the loudest person dominates. There's always someone who's way off tangent and keeps dragging everyone with them. And just people have a massive fear of sounding stupid. And so the first person who says, oh, I don't have that problem, has basically guaranteed that no one else will admit to having that problem. A lot of times you will find when people have problems that they're willing to spend money to solve, there is a lot of shame, embarrassment, anger involved. And those are emotions that people don't necessarily want to express publicly. Especially like in the data case, when I talk to people with Kissmetrics, we would get people just being sort of like infuriated or just like, oh, I feel like I should do this, but this stuff makes me feel so dumb, and it's part of my job. And I just think no one would say that in front of a bunch of people. It's surprising that they say that one-on-one conversation, but they do, and which is why you should all do customer development. But that's the really interesting stuff, and you're much less likely to get it in groups.
So what isn't on that list is a website and a bunch of AdWords. How do you feel about a website as part of a customer development process? Is it important or not?
I think it is very difficult to get sufficient traffic to it if you have the means of doing so. Oh, sorry. The question, what's not listed on here is having a website that's directed by AdWords where you can find people, as a means of finding people. I think that it's difficult to get traffic to that website. Buying traffic has gotten more expensive now that everyone has caught on to it as a trick. If you have a very strong Twitter following, a la Heaton Shaw, and you can get 10,000 people to go to your splash site, awesome. It's a really easy thing to do. If you have an existing product, if you're an existing company and you have a bunch of customers and you don't mind having them know about the second product that you're thinking about, that's also pretty easy. For everyone else, it's hard. And I think that people have a very human connection when you have reached out to them. If I go up to you and say, Brad, I really would like to talk to you for these reasons, there's a very strong incentive for you to say yes. If you go to a website, that connection is so much weaker. So the problem has to be so clear and compelling. It has to be that this is something you're desperate about, and it's been described in just the way that captures you for you to follow through. And you can do that, but it's difficult.
Is it worth having a site that you spend, say, 20 hours on getting to a nice point that might? Do people, as part of this process, hit your website and care about what it looks like?
Do people, as part of the process, hit the website and care?
Yeah. Do people come to your website and care what it looks like? I would say that surprisingly few people have asked, do you have a website when I do these? I actually prefer not to send people to a website, at least not until after an interview is over, because again, anything they see will taint what they say. So even if they've come to your website and they just see a few bullet points, they're going to tailor their responses even subconsciously around those bullet points and basically say, like, here's how I would use X versus here is the problem I have. So it's fine to have one. I wouldn't send people to it before I had talked to them. You might get some leads from it. You might also choose to use it as a sort of MVP. So maybe after you send people, after you've talked to people, you might send people there, say to collect some survey data or try and ask for a pre-order or something like that. But in terms of just like kind of putting out honey and hoping the bees come, not sure if that's worth it.
Thanks.
So the templates for reaching out to people. And you'll get the slides later, so you don't have to write this down. So asking the right questions. People stress out about this a lot, and it's actually not that hard because most of what you should be doing is listening anyways. So what you want to know in summary is, what is your potential customer already doing? And the reason is that existing behaviors are easy to capitalize on. It is very, very hard to get people to change the way they're behaving. So the more you understand about how people are what they're doing today and what they find normal, and how you can kind of scaffold onto that, the better. So you want to know what they're doing today. That's a very general question, and I tend to recommend asking a question that is one step up, abstracted from what you're actually trying to do. So, instead of saying, tell me about how you, get site analytics, or tell me about how you exchange information within your company, might be like, tell me about how you get work done. Tell me about how you communicate with your coworkers. Because you don't want people to give you a highly specific answer. You also don't want people to talk about something that might not be important to them. So if you ask a very specific question, people will answer that question, whether or not it's something they really care about. So someone might go down a whole lot of detail about, this is how I use chat messages and blah, 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 blah. But if you were to look at their actual work pattern, maybe they use chat less than 5 minutes a day. That's something that would be more important for you to know than what they do in that 5 minutes. So asking the abstracted question, what they do today. What they're frustrated by and what their constraints are. Again, in an enterprise world, this has a huge amount to do with what people will do and buy. Someone who is extremely tech savvy will have a different set of frustrations than someone who is not. Someone who is a mid-level manager will have a very different set of frustrations from someone who is an exec or an individual contributor. Someone who has access to all the information they need to do their job versus someone who has to go email the data guy every time they want something. And then similarly, constraints. People who work in medicine or law or finance or government have a whole host of constraints that just block them from doing anything interesting at all. And then finally, how they decide, how they buy, how they use. So you don't want to ask about your product because you don't want to be selling at this point. So a useful thing is to ask about what's the last time you guys bought a solution. When you decided to use a new process at work, how did that decision happen? Who talked about it? How was the discussion go? Who made the final call? Last time you guys decided to introduce a new tool, who wrote the check? Who did you have to convince? How hard was that? Was this a budget approval thing that happens once a year, or do you have a corporate card that you can reimburse things on? Last time you guys bought new software, how was it evaluated? Was someone at risk of getting fired if this thing didn't work out? These things are very important because they impact a lot of what people will do. A lot of times these questions don't occur as much to product people. Long ago at Yodlee when I was doing this, I found that we would have a whole host of product questions, and then as soon as the sales guy came in, we would basically get the answers to these things and be like, oh, if we'd known this 6 months ago, that would have made a huge impact. So I start asking a lot about that, not in terms of will you buy this today, but last time you bought something, and try and get these insights. Because there's a massive difference between the person who can just put things on a corporate card and the person who needs a signature for everything. Those are the big questions. Those are the big areas. You may notice that they're really generic, and that's okay because people are just going to talk about themselves, and that's what you want. The more specific your questions are, the more you're sort of biasing the responses you're going to get. So the main things I say are, you want to get people to talk. And the important thing there is that you want to set up that they are the expert. And that is a shift in dynamics from what you're used to, because every day, 90% of the time, you guys are the experts. You're making every decision. You're designing things. You're thinking through things. But right now, what you're doing is temporarily putting yourself in the position where you're assuming that all or 50% of your assumptions are wrong. And so you need to actually make it very clear to this person that they're the one who should talk. And so I usually start by just jumping into the question, not doing a lot of intro about myself or the product or trying to gain credibility. That goes against our instincts. We usually like to make ourselves seem credible. We talk about, our job titles, and when we went to college, that's how you know that maybe I have something important to say, is because we had this whole intro to start with. But when you're talking to your customers, usually they don't have that position of power, and you want to make them feel it. A lot of times, what this really is about is taking the unsung hero and making them feel really special for a while, and in return, they give you basically the keys to the castle. So I basically start by just saying, hi, is this still a good time? I'm really excited you could talk to me. I would love it if you could tell me about the last time you did whatever. And then I just stop, and I try to be silent for as long as possible. And I say 60 seconds, which is actually a really long time, but it's a goal to go for. And the reason is that if you start a conversation with someone, think about the last time you saw someone, and they're like, hey, how are you doing? And you're like, oh, well, I've been really busy. And they're like, yeah, that's great. And that's basically signal that that's enough. That's all you needed to say. And we tend to want to affirm people quickly so that they will feel comfortable. But what that's actually doing is saying, that was okay that you gave me a one-sentence answer. That's all I really need out of you. And that's very counterproductive. So you say the tell me about, and then you're just silent. If you're face-to-face, I recommend having a notebook so you can kind of pretend that you're taking notes. That makes it seem less like you're being a jackass. If you're on the phone, it's easier because you don't have to look at them. But be silent as long as possible. And what most people will do is give you a short answer and then pause.
Is face-to-face better, or is over the phone good enough?
It's face-to-face better, or is over the phone good enough? I do most customer development over the phone, and there's a couple reasons for it. One, you probably can't write fast enough to take down all the notes that you want, and I hate asking people to record them because that's immediately putting them on the defensive. Two, in a company where you want other people to listen to customers, you can have other people sitting in the room, and actually we do that at Yammer. We had a lot of initial resistance from engineers who did not want to talk to customers or listen to customers and thought it would be a total waste of time. And we told them that they were required to be note takers for at least 2 user interviews. 1 hour. We said, you can't complain about 1 hour. We gave them a template, said, you're going to sit in the room, you don't have to talk, no one will know you're there, take notes. And all of them came away, of course, being like, that was amazing. And they would refer, we'd find them quoting users later on. So everyone thought it was good. They all complained terribly. But that's beautiful because you can have people in the room, the other person doesn't know. It's very covert that way.
Wait, don't people hate being put on speakerphone?
If you're in a small room, they can't really tell. I mean, they probably do if you ask. I don't mention that they're on speakerphone. Or if I do, I'll say that you're on speakerphone because I need to take notes. And then the person in the corner just sits in the corner and takes notes. Yeah.
Do you record the conversations?
I do not.
Do you record the conversation?
Oh, do I record the conversations? I don't, because then you have to go back and listen to them again, and no one has that kind of time. It's great if you can play a little soundbite for someone. It's very convincing if they weren't, taking notes to listen to it. It's also just unrealistic. If you are doing enough customer development, the last thing you want to do is go listen to everything again. So I recommend taking, good notes. And if you're on the phone, you can use your laptop. It's not unfriendly. That's the other problem with face-to-face. You can't have your laptop up, and most people can't take notes on tablets quickly enough. Yeah.
And you're not supposed to ask leading questions, like when you're actually performing the interview?
No, you are not supposed to ask leading questions.
Right.
Yes.
So the question is, like, if before you can design the questionnaire or the conversation you want to have with the patient, with the person, do you actually think about what kind of metrics you want to collect, or any sort of calculation that you want to have when you perform multiple conversations? Are there any specific things that you still look for, even though the questions aren't designed to be leading?
So you have, yeah. I'm terrible at repeating these things. So the question is, do you have specific metrics for things that you're looking for? And if so, how do you get those, seeing as how you're not supposed to be asking leading questions? So the purpose of customer development is that you are trying to invalidate your hypothesis. So you wrote a hypothesis about the kind of people, the kinds of problem, the kind of tasks. You might have had a couple if you have a two-sided market. You might have had a couple if you had something about distribution. Your core thing is to understand, is to try and invalidate those points. Other things you want to learn are the things I mentioned in the last slide, how people behave. So you can have goals of things you want to learn. And as people are talking, you can ask questions to help evince those. So if someone gives you an answer about how they behave and how they chose their last product that they used, but they don't mention other stakeholders, you can ask, were you the only person involved in that decision? Most questions can be rephrased so that they are not leading. The trick is basically that don't ask yes/no questions. Don't ask questions that start with a contraction. Don't you find? Didn't you find? Wouldn't you like? Anything that starts like that is leading and bad. And you'll slip up occasionally and ask them, and I usually make like a note in my notes that I accidentally asked a leading question, and then you can basically ignore whatever came later. This is another good reason for note takers, because they are much better than you at spotting it. It is very hard to recognize when you asked a leading question or cut someone off too early, and your note taker will sit there and make faces at you, and after it's over tell you, I can't believe you asked this thing. So they keep you honest. That's a very good use for that.
On the 60 seconds of silence, so are you literally silent? Nobody's talking. The recipient's not talking for 60 seconds.
What typically happens is that people will talk to fill the space. So you will ask a question, and someone will say, "Oh yeah, this is what I do for a living. I fill out the Excel spreadsheets and I check in this thing." Well, and then I do this and this and this. Or they'll say, like, "Is there anything else that you wanted me to say?" And then you can prompt them. You shouldn't ignore direct questions. But almost no one will just sit there blindly, dumbly. Yeah.
This is very specific. Do you throw in some in there to like keep them going, or do you just stay silent?
The question is, do you
Right.
skip?
Right. Do you throw in affirmations to keep them going, or do you stay silent? So, at minimum, you should be making noise. I actually saw a tweet a while back with someone saying, "Oh, you should put the phone on mute. This is a terrible idea because then the person will not hear anything and be like, 'Hello? Are you still there? Hello?'" So you don't want to do that. I might make a very gentle, like, but I try not to be even as direct as say, because that, again, kind of sounds like, okay, that was enough. Very non-committal noise. And again, I'd wait for that. If you get that silence and you kind of wait for a count of like 1, 2, 3, 4, okay, they're really not talking, to kind of prompt them along. But yeah, it's a good question, because this is one of those, like, you're pulling a psychological trick for your own benefit, so it's good to do it well. And only do that once, because it really works to set the tone of the conversation. If you keep doing it, it feels really manipulative, and you don't want to do that. I wouldn't hurry to interrupt people, but I also would not continue to just be silent. Occasionally I'll say, "Oh, hold on, I'm just still writing that down," which is the more polite version of silence for later on. So, as I said, no leading questions, no yes/no questions. That's basically kind of the same thing. This one is actually the one leading question that I found is generally okay, is the "other people have told me" trick. And that is especially when you really think that someone has a certain problem or a certain situation and you have not gotten them to fess up to it yet. And it might be because it's something like embarrassing, it's something they don't know how to do and they wish they did, or it might just be that they haven't mentioned it yet. And somehow the mythical "other people" gives them permission to agree or disagree. But because it's just some other people, I've noticed it's really good response bait. So you might say, "Other people have told me that it's a lot easier to get approval for this kind of software if they can get it, listed as, CapEx." And they'll be like, "Oh, well, that's not the way it works in my company at all." Or they'll say, "Oh, that's totally right." And then you can ask a little bit more around that. If they don't bite, don't push it. But I found that can be helpful. Again, "Other people have told me that they have a really hard time doing blah, blah, blah." You've kind of given them permission to admit to it. I wouldn't start with it, but especially after you've done a few customer development interviews, you might notice that several people have said the same thing. And then you really just want to see, does person number 4 agree with these last 3 people? And then you might kind of throw it in just lightly to see if they do or not. If you think they're suggestible, also you can actually say "other people have told me" and tell them something that's the complete opposite. "Other people have told me that it's much easier to do blah, blah, blah." And someone will be like, "Oh, that's not the way it is for me at all." That's a little bit lower risk, because it's the opposite of leading, really. And then just lots of journalistic questions, and these are generally the follow-ups to things to these. So you've asked a question, "Tell me about how blah, 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 blah." you're probably going to need to ask a couple of, so how did that work? So how often does this happen? So why was that a good idea? Why is tricky also because it can sound accusatory. So why is where I recommend a lot of linguistic softening. You know, can you tell me, why do you do this? Just to make sure I understand. Why is it that your company does things this way? Just one of those things. Yeah.
Kind of going back to my previous, can you ask ranking questions? Can you ask them to rank stuff on a scale of 1 to 5? Is that useful, or is that kind of also considered weak?
Right. Can you ask ranking questions? I find that in the beginning stages of customer development, you don't know what the 1 through 5 options should be. The first things I would probably go for are like, what are your biggest pain points? After you've done some, then ranking can come into play. Maybe after you've talked to a certain number of people, you have a really good guess about what 5 things are important. At that point, you can even start going to surveys. If you have a really good sense of both the question and the answer, go for scale. But most people start on surveys too early before they know both the question and the likely answer. So talked about a little of this. Tell me about how you do this today. It's a really good opening question. Do you use any products, apps, tricks, processes, hacks to get this done? And again, you are interested in if they use other tools because you want to know if they use other tools, what's good and bad about them. If they have a process for doing something, is that a process that they need to use or something they've come up with on their own? If there are other supporting apps, you can ask a lot of detailed questions on that. I'll find sometimes if people say that they use certain tools, I might specifically go find people who use that tool and ask them questions about it. At Yodlee or at Yammer, we'll find people say they use, say, HipChat. So we've gone and just talked to HipChat users and figured out how they use HipChat and tried to figure if there were any insights from that that we could add into the product. And then you can kind of do that separately. The nice thing about those is that everyone assumes that you are from that company and you don't really have to own up to that you're not. That works pretty well. This is my favorite question, and it's a little bit cheesy, but it works really, really well. And that's because most people you're talking to do not have the background and the imagination to come up with the products that you guys can build. And so what most people will tell you is something that is constrained by their experience. Cue Henry Ford, faster horse, etc. So I'll say, you know, if you could have, say, wave a magic wand and solve this problem anyway, like don't worry about if it's possible, what would you do? And that frees people to tell you ridiculous things that might actually be possible. Again, and it makes them laugh a little bit too, so they know like it's okay. This is kind of cheesy, so I'm not going to say something and you're going to be wrong, because you know you don't want to give an answer and have it be so blatantly wrong that the person laughs at you. Again, fear of feeling stupid. So you know, what if I would really love, you know, say, you know, a hover car, right? And I'm talking to the Tesla guys. I'm like, oh yeah, I would love a hover car. You know, are they going to laugh at me? Am I going to feel stupid by saying that? Actually, they probably wouldn't. They're probably working on one right now. But, you know, maybe I'm talking to, you know, the people who make the Leaf or something, right? Nissan. We're a little more down to earth. You don't want to ask for something dumb because you don't want to get laughed at. But it might also be that it's completely possible. You know, I've given the example a couple times of like Siri. I think before that thing came out, what did most people think about voice recognition technology? They thought about calling their utility company and hearing the automated voice and trying to say, pay bill. No, pay bill. No, operator. If that's your notion of voice recognition technology, you could never ask for something like Siri. You could never say, you know what I would really love when I'm driving and I'm crossing the bridge and the gas fuel light has been on for like the last 15 miles and I'm really desperate to find a gas station. I would just like to be able to pick up my phone and say, where can I get gas? That sounds like crazy talk, and yet clearly it was possible. But if someone asked you the magic wand question, you might say, that's what I would like. So that is far and away favorite thing. You can ask it for products that exist as well as products that don't exist.
I use that all the time in my consulting. It's solid gold, that question.
Yeah. That's good stuff. Before and after, I like this because people's idea of a task is not necessarily the whole task. So you say, like, when you do this thing, what do you do immediately before, and what do you do after? And the thing is, for example, I know someone who is working on a personal shopping service. And when you think about what's involved in going shopping, most people will say, I get in the car and I go to the store and I buy things and I come home. But that's not true. There's a whole host of things that happened before, which is maybe it's I look in the cupboards and I see what I'm out of and I make a list and I ask the rest of the people in the household what they need to buy. And I think about, are we going to be eating at home this week, or is this a week that we're going to be out? Am I going on vacation in 3 days? Do I need things that are in the freezer? Is it going to be really hot weather and I'm not going to want cold, heavy foods? You do all of that. Maybe you even do coupons. Certainly outside of San Francisco, the rest of the world still deals with coupons. And then you go to the store and you get the things, and then you come home and then you yell at the kids to help you put the things away, and you think about meal planning. And there's a huge amount of activities that are centered in the problem of keeping your household fed. But if you ask people about shopping, they will give you a very narrow range of answers. And this is a lot of potential for competitive differentiation, because most of your competitors are also looking at this spectrum of a task. But your work is not done until everyone is fed. So if you can take part of the burden of the before and the after and include that into your product, you can make something that is much more compelling. It's also another way to get at some more of those like tools, stakeholders. For example, stakeholders, if you go grocery shopping, you have stakeholders, like the other people who will refuse to eat the things that you buy if you don't buy the right thing. Yeah. Just kind of the catch-all. Is there anything else I should have asked about? And especially in enterprise, this is really useful because a lot of times people will talk to you very eagerly and enthusiastically, and at the end of the whole shebang, they will say something like, but you know who you should really talk to? You should talk to that guy in the other department. And part of you is like, but it's good because they'll usually give you that person's name and intro you, and it's awesome. There's inevitably something once someone has gotten all this talking out and feels really good by now because they basically talked about this thing that was killing them for 20 minutes and they're kind of euphoric. And at this point they're like, yeah, you should talk about this other thing. You should have asked me about this. And then you do. And then probably roll that into your next interview. So those are those are the highlights of the questions. You'll have specific things that come up. But in the beginning, I start really generic because, again, you don't necessarily know what the questions are until you've heard people mention the problems. So logistics, things you might be wondering about. Compensation, I don't do it. And the reason is that you want people who care a lot about this problem. And offering them money or gift cards or something kind of interferes with that amount that they care. Also, if you're talking to people in companies, you will sometimes have vendor gift issues going on. People might not be able to accept compensation. Certainly at Yammer, we actually, when we do things beyond a short question, we actually do give charitable donations. People can choose which charity to donate to because many of our customers cannot accept an Amazon gift card or anything from a vendor. Even if you're not a vendor yet, people may be a little bit uneasy about the rules of their workplace. So generally, I found that the best compensation is treating people like they're experts and being really, really enthusiastic about the time that they're giving you. And even better yet, if you follow up afterwards with a thank you and maybe even a here's the things I learned from everyone else, that goes a huge, huge way. We talked about this a little bit, on-site, face-to-face, phone. On-site is a useful thing to do a few times, to see people in their environment, to maybe see who comes over to talk to them, to kind of get your own sense about where the centers of power are, et cetera. But it's actually a really hard ask unless you have existing relationships. And generally, there's such friction in people doing customer development that I'd say don't try making the perfect be the enemy of the good. I like phone. You can hear people's intonations in their voice. You can kind of hear when they're getting frustrated or they're angry or they're excited. You can take notes. You can have your friend take notes with you. And people don't have to look at you, which I actually think helps a little bit with talking about the things that might be embarrassing or frustrating, or if they're kind of, throwing their coworker under the bus. That happens a little bit better over the phone. So I like that. It's my personal favorite use case. Recording, again, don't like it. Sets people at dis-ease, and then you have to listen to the recordings afterwards. I know there are some products on the market that help with customer development interviews. I think that help you record what times people said interesting things. I haven't tried them out personally just because, again, you have to ask people before you record them, and I feel like that just sets the conversation off at a kind of disadvantage, as opposed to the kind of even playing field that you're trying to set up. Let's see, who needs to interview in your company? Preferably everyone, but that's often hard to do. You guys as the founders are the most important because it is your baby that is being called ugly, and it's good to hear it. But as you get bigger, I find that engineers are a really key audience to listen to these things because they tend to be the most isolated from normal users, and they tend to, anything that is technical will make more sense to them. And it is very helpful to have this kind of humanizing contact. And again, the note taker is a really good hack. You're asking them for a concrete thing. It doesn't sound quite as touchy-feely as just listening to people, and it helps with a lot of agreement costs later on.
So when there's just two of us, would you recommend that both, founders sit in on every customer development call?
So if there's just two.
Mm-hmm. Would I recommend that both co-founders sit in on every customer development call?
Or
3 or 4? No, I think that's going to be, one, a waste of time, and two, really hard to coordinate with your schedules. I think you should all be doing customer development interviews and comparing notes on them on a regular basis. I don't think you both need, or 3 or however many need to be there.
What is the target duration for these interviews, and what is the minimum duration for
What is the target duration for these interviews? I typically ask for 15 to 20 minutes. I find that they typically go over a little bit. You can tell pretty quickly if an interview is not going to yield anything because you just get kind of short responses and people have very little emotion for the question. They don't latch onto it. Those I try and just kind of cut short and say, okay, maybe this isn't a problem that you're having. Is there anyone else you know of who might have this problem? You never know, they might refer you to someone, and just say, I don't want to waste your time, and cut that short. Generally, you will hear a sound of interest pretty quickly. I find that, they usually go over. A half hour is probably a good average. Some people keep talking for longer. I find that if they're really talking for longer, 45 minutes is kind of my max, where I'll just cut off and say, oh, I'm really sorry. I don't want to take up too much of your day. If you're really interested in this, maybe I could reach out to you again when I'm a little farther along in my thinking, or when I have some mock-ups to show you. And someone who's talked for 45 minutes will almost certainly agree to that, and that's awesome because you can then do a solution interview where you're showing them stuff and having them interact with something specific. But 15 to 20 minutes is a good ask. It's not even a full calendar slot, so it's kind of hard to say no to, as long as you're interested in it. Let's see. Customer isn't useful. I kind of talked about that. If people don't sound interested, just cut it short. So what are you looking for? And this is a little bit getting back to your question. You are looking for invalidation or validation. And I usually actually when we have people take notes, the note-taking template looks just like this. It has space under each of these things where people can write down their notes under these categories. You are primarily looking to validate or invalidate your hypothesis. When someone says something that agrees with you, write it in the right place. When someone says something that disagrees with you, write it in the right place. The other big things, though, which I think are actually more useful in terms of developing the product, are things that surprised you, that you were not expecting to hear at all, and most importantly, emotion. So when people express emotion, that is their way of prioritizing. And so in answer to the ranking question, people are subconsciously ranking based on how angry or excited or thumping the table or infuriated they are. Those are the things that they care most about. They might say objectively that X is the most important thing, but if they can say that with like no affect in their voice, then it's just not. It might be the thing that they think they're supposed to care about the most, but it probably is not the thing that they actually care about the most. And again, humans are irrational. It may be that they are told on paper to care about this, but secretly they know that their boss really, really cares about this other thing, and that means they're going to be motivated by that other thing. So typically we'll write down the impassioned cries or complaints, just kind of go in the emotion section. And we look at those and say, like, these are the things that generated the most emotion. And that's where we poke more in asking the why and what and how and who. Because something that someone cares about that much is where there is insight gold. So taking all these things together, typically after you have a certain amount of notes, you can kind of look at these and see the patterns. Like, this is where everyone is freaking out. This is where people are giving you polite answers. You know, even if they're polite, yeah, that sounds great, answers, that's not. They're just being nice. So based on that, what do you build? You've actually learned something at some point. You've got a bunch of insights, and now the instinct a lot of times will be, let's go do a lot of stuff. And that's not usually the correct response. The first thing is, what is your biggest risk? So when you're validating, the whole thing you're trying to do here is constantly be reducing risk. And usually your biggest risk is that no one will care enough to even try this product. Your next biggest risk might be no one can ever get budget to do this. Whatever it is for you specifically is the area that you want to kind of tweak on first. So again, like in a two-sided market case, if one of those sides is harder to reach than the other, that's probably your bigger risk. That seems like the person you should be talking to more. If distribution is your biggest risk, that's the thing you should be working on. And then I like to use the magic wand question on yourself. Or another way of kind of doing that is to say, let's say we only had 2 weeks to do something. What would be the one thing we did? Because it is very hard, and now, you know, I'm at Yammer, and through no fault of my own, I'm now part of Microsoft, and so I'm constantly dealing with people who say, but we have a bazillion users. All 600 of these use cases are valid. And they're correct. There are hundreds of thousands of users for each one of those use cases. But at some point, there are things that if you only had 2 weeks of engineering, you would do, you know, create new doc and save. Those are probably at the top. Lots of other things fall below that. So it can be useful to do this sort of ordinal prioritization of like, of all the things we could validate, if we could only do one, it would be this. And, you know, start with that one. And give yourself permission to not build things. The other thing is that your MVP is not going to be scalable. It should not need to be scalable. So I heard a lot of low touch, no touch in the room. That is a fine goal to get to, but there are probably a lot of questions that are higher risk to get to first. So getting to those first is probably a good idea. There are, like, the first few customers you go through will probably be very painful and require a lot of hand-holding. At Kissmetrics, I set up people's analytics funnels, went to their offices and sat by them and went through their websites and learned their workflows and learned what they called their events and viewed source. And it was very, very long. And there is no way the company would ever have been profitable if we had to do that for every single customer. But having to do that for the first 10 or 20 customers was critical because it uncovered a bunch of assumptions that we had that were wrong. It also made those 10 or 20 people really, really forgiving of all the ways that the product was crappy in the beginning. So your MVP is going to be painful, and you can only do a few of them, but that's okay because you will learn good things. The things you're going to build, there are a bunch of different kinds, and I think since some of you already have customers, you are doing some of these. The concierge MVP is where you're going through and you're like a hotel concierge setting up, or like me at Kissmetrics, setting up, asking people what their databases are, asking for the kinds of questions they have, hand-holding them, sitting there like the data guy and walking through every single example with them. It is something that is completely not scalable. It is something where the customer knows that you are doing this, and you were probably even face-to-face with them. It is very, very good for building up a relationship that is ongoing. It's very good for finding lots of ways that you were wrong. It is also exhausting, but again, you don't have to do that many. A similar one is the Wizard of Oz MVP, which is basically where you are doing that, but the customer does not know. So this might be a website that has an input field, and instead of having an automated thing, you're actually sitting there waiting for someone to type something in, and you're typing something back frantically. This works really well if you have something that supposedly has an algorithm behind it. So someone asks for something, research this thing for me, and you're like, yes, we are processing your response. And then you go and you do it by hand, and then you send it back to the person. Again, a useful way of validating that this is the right thing. You might discover that when you send back that wonderfully written report, that people don't click on it, or they look at part of it and they don't read anymore, or they write back and complain about certain things. It is much cheaper to fix your method of automating things than it is to rewrite a lot of algorithms. So these can be really useful when you have kind of a complex process. Concierge is really good when you're not sure what elements of the experience matter. So again, if you want like a seamless user experience, the problem with that is that it's very hard for us to know what the seams are that are most important. You will probably not get to something that is seamless and low touch immediately. That's actually almost impossible unless, well, I can't even say unless you're Steve Jobs anymore, because that's not an option. But if you are sitting there talking to someone, you can see the things that are particularly important to them and the things where maybe they would be okay with having a less optimal experience. Wizard of Oz, kind of the same thing. You can see how people actually interact. Single use case MVP is actually probably where a lot of you are. That's where there's lots of things that you think your product should do eventually, but right now it does one. And that is good because if you're solving a valid use case, people will use that one, and then they will complain about the other things that are not there. That's good. Your users should be complaining. I'm going to repeat that one again. Your customers should be complaining. If they're not complaining, you're building too much stuff. Because customers who complain are customers who like your stuff. We don't complain about things we don't care about. We complain about things that we care about that are infuriating us in some way. And that's okay, because we care enough. When your customers complain, they are helping you prioritize. They also are giving you an opening where you can ask them more questions. You basically get some free market research in there. And you know where you're kind of going next. If you have like happy customers who are just using your product in silence, those are customers who will switch to another alternative when it comes up because they have no particular loyalty.
When's the right time during the customer development process to get people sat down in front of an MVP?
When's the right time to get people sat down in front of an MVP? I've heard before some people talk about having a problem phase and a solution phase. I guess I've never officially put it that way, but that's basically what I'm thinking, is that when you start, or when you start doing customer development, even if you already have a product, there is a point in time where you should be just asking people what their problems are with no hint that there is any solution in sight. Because your entire focus is making sure that your problem statement was valid. Then, in a separate bucket, there is also showing people stuff that you have and seeing how they like it. It might be the same people, it might be different people. It's great if it's the same people. That's not always possible. I don't recommend trying to combine them because I think that's very dangerous. And I think it's useful to have that validation first. Even if the product you have, you might find that your hypothesis is invalid, but you still have this product sitting here. It's fine to go ahead and put that in front of people and see if their comments kind of jibe with this over here. But I would put more weight on what people said when they weren't looking at something. But basically, you want to be continuously learning. So it's not like I recommend you go on hiatus and do customer development for 3 months without writing any code. That seems counterproductive. You might do a week, and you might be continuing to do interviews. You should be, in fact, while you're building things up. But I try and keep them pretty separate. And if you have someone who really wants to see, I'd love to see this. Do you have a demo? Do you have mock-ups? Again, that's where I would schedule, like, I would love to show you something. When we have it, can I contact you again? And then even if you contact them the next week, that's fine. But then you have a different conversation, which is focused on here is this thing, let's see how you use it. Let's see. Others, pre-order or vaporware MVP. This is where I recommend that the site in question, so having your splash site, if you have access to people and you can send them there, this is a good way of doing an MVP. If you're going to do this, like I said before, you need some sense that people are going to invest in you. At minimum, I would say that your splash site should have a description of the problem and then ask for some survey questions, one of which is, can I contact you for a beta or for an interview? That's kind of the minimum I would consider a bar of effort. If someone's willing to give you their email address and answer 5 questions, that's a small sign of interest. If they're going to pay thousands of dollars for your product, it's a pretty small sign, but it's something. But if it's something where you could actually conceivably have someone pre-order or sign me up for the beta, then that's a bigger step. And again, for enterprise, this is a little bit less valid. For consumer, you can do these pre-order things. They're pretty easy. You can take people's credit cards and just not charge them, and just never charge them if you don't end up building the product. It's a little bit harder to do with hospitals and schools and enterprises. But Steve Blank would talk about getting a letter of intent. That's kind of a similar, though perhaps high-touch thing. Even just add me to the beta program. If you kind of make the language sound like signing up for that means someone is going to call you on the telephone repeatedly, that's its own level of investment. And if no one pre-orders or signs up for the beta, you got some pivoting to do. And then finally, other people's products. There are a lot of cases where someone else is doing something similar to you. You can either steal APIs or do usability testing on someone else's product, or just kind of mishmash something that someone else has done in with what you've done. I know someone who was thinking of starting a Lyft type business and actually signed up as a Lyft driver and put the little mustache on his car and gave rides for like 3 weeks as a means of understanding how that interaction worked, what the setup was, what it was like to pick people up, what the potential problems were. So that's, technically he's making money for his competitor, but he was also bootstrapping off an infrastructure that other people had already spent a huge amount of time putting in place in order to learn. So things like that can be a great way to actually put something in front of people without you having to build it. Metrics. Talked about this a little bit before. So this is going to be highly dependent on what stage you're at and what you're building. But generally, I like to talk about kind of what I call first order metrics, which is something that is directly connected to your success. When people start thinking about data, a lot of times they start being obsessed with all the data they can collect. How many people clicked on this link? How many people made it to this page? How many people, tried this feature? Fundamentally, there's a couple of things that matter to you. They are probably, did people come back? Did people pay you money? Did people do whatever the core use case that you want? If you had like a photo sharing site, someone better freaking share a photo. If they haven't, you're just not going to succeed. So pick a couple of those. You should not have 10 or 20 metrics. That is too many. There are probably 2 or 3 you care about. If you have a multi-sided market, maybe there's 2 or 3 per stakeholder. These might be percentages, like an increase in sign-up conversions. You can't predict this unless you're in the very beginning. Like, it's mostly unrealistic to say this is going to create a 10% lift in X. Because the only time you get 10% lifts is when you're in the very beginning and you have so much stuff broken that you can't help but get 10% better. The more customers you have, you will start getting very, very excited about 0.25% things. That's like champagne at Yammer. But knowing that something is going to go up is something that is worth caring about. It might be things like a decrease in time between sign up and successful task completion. Again, if you were doing the photo sharing thing, does it take people 2 days between the time they register and share a photo, or does it take 5 minutes? The 5-minute case, those people are likely to stick around and use your product and pay. The people where it takes 2 days, that might be the first and last photo they ever share. So looking at things, again, and that's your core metric, so how quickly can you get to that is a pretty great thing. At Yammer, it's your first 7 days of engagement has a huge impact on whether or not you will stick around and keep using Yammer. So if you sign up and you don't really use it in your first 7 days, and then maybe, later in the month you come back a few times, that's still not a great sign. If we can get you to do a lot of things in that first 7 days, you will probably come back, even if we could, magically talk to you and those first 7 days you were unimpressed, but if you'd returned several times, that has had a strong predictive impact for us. You might not have analytics if you're early on, especially, and so it's okay to have things that are not numerical, as long as you are honest with yourself about what they mean, and you have written them down in advance to make sure that you're not just fudging them. For example, a customer says, we want customers to be saying things that sound like this instead of this. Yammer, big problem, we look a lot like Facebook. So one of the initiatives we have right now that we're working on is actually, one of our metrics for success will be, we can show this to a random person and they will not say, this looks like Facebook. This is a metric for success because looking like Facebook equals not looking like work. And that has a huge impact on whether or not people will use the product. And so there's not a metric behind that, there's not a number, but we've gone to coffee shops and shown randos off the street mock-ups of Yammer, and they're like, oh yeah, it looks like Facebook. I would post about where do I go to lunch with my coworkers, and this makes us want to hit our head against the table. If we could repeat that experiment and show them versions of an updated version, and they would say, really anything else. It looks like Outlook, it looks like a project management site, it looks like something where I would talk to my boss. Those are all good answers. They're all successful measures of success. And sometimes that is fine. But the important thing is to come up with these things first and write them down so you keep yourself honest, so that when you're showing your MVPs, you can actually say, this is what we were hoping to see, but we didn't see it. We were hoping that we would get 100 pre-orders, but we got 12. We were hoping that people would say, this is exactly what we wanted, but we got people saying, oh, maybe I'll try it. We were hoping that we would take less than 2 hours for people to set up the product. It's taking a day and a half, and we have a high abandonment rate. So just kind of being honest about those things is a big help. And these will change over time. But again, if you're writing things down, you can kind of keep track of, this is where we started, this is what our new goal is, this is what our new goal is, and kind of work accordingly. So that's kind of the rundown. I'll answer other questions here. I seriously will always answer. Cindy at cindyalvarez.com. Most people always think I'm being polite when I say that, but I really like answering questions about customer development. So if you have them, feel free to send them. And then at some point, Lean Customer Development will be out.
And we'll celebrate.
And we'll celebrate. We will all celebrate. It will be there. I'll also be speaking at the Lean Startup Conference in December about how Microsoft, the beast, is becoming lean one group at a time.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you.